Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Access Blockbusters. It is a very special episode of the Access Blockbusters pod today because we are beginning a new journey into the DCEU, which ironically is an older property at this point because we are going to be getting the new DCU coming out with Creature Commandos and Superman Legacy. But I thought, and I suppose that, just kind of taking a step back and looking at the channel as a whole, I didn't really envision this being sort of what the channel had become, but I think it's slowly become one of my favorite parts of every year doing a different rewatch series of something that, has come out before, is finishing up, is wrapping up. So we started out with the Infinity Saga. Those were some of the first videos that I did on the YouTube channel, rewatching Avengers, all the Avengers films, starting with the first Iron Man, and going through all 23 of those films. And then by that point it was about time for Spider-Man No Way Home, so we rewatched all the Spider-Man films, we did the Star Wars films, and we just wrapped up the MCU Phase 4. And I thought, I think with the introduction of the DCU coming out very soon, which will have some carryover for sure from the old DCEU, but the DCEU is officially done for the most part. I think, obviously, like I said, we'll have some characters that are carrying over that we can talk about later. Certainly not in this film as we start off with the first one, Man of Steel. But I thought it would be a great opportunity, just, as I was thinking about what else there was, to rewatch and what would be interesting for the channel, to go back through the DCEU and talk about some of my thoughts on each individual film. Because honestly, unlike the MCU, which I really grew up with, the MCU was sort of a big part of what life was like growing up, and just a big part of what I enjoyed. The DCEU, I did watch. I believe I actually watched every single film except for Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. So when we finally get to Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, it will be actually the first time I've seen the film, which is going to be interesting for sure. But yeah, no, I've seen all the DCEU films, and I like a few of them for sure. But I don't think I had any one particular film in the DCEU that I really loved. That being said, for most of these DCEU films, I've actually only seen maybe once or twice, either in theaters and then maybe once later. And so honestly, for me personally, because I had seen, all the Infinity Saga films many times. I'd seen the Star Wars films many times, the Spider-Man films, even Phase 4, I'd seen most of those at least a couple times, if not, clips and things like that. But this rewatch series, or set of podcast episodes that we're going to be doing every once in a while on the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, and the Access Blockbusters pod feed on Spotify, is actually almost more interesting to me than anything that we've done before, in terms of rewatching. Because again, if you haven't been here for any of the previous rewatch series, I explain this usually in the beginning of those series, but I want to reiterate it here, is that I try to go into these rewatches, I try to go into anything I'm viewing with just an open mindset and a positive outlook, because it really, to me, I feel like it is my own loss if I'm not getting as much enjoyment out of a project as I can. Doesn't mean that I'm going to lie to myself and say, oh, I hate this for the sake, I love this, and I'm going to ignore all the flaws and things that do actually bother me. That's not the kind of person I am. I'm here to, do actual analysis, think deeply about these movies as well, but I want to enjoy them as much as possible. And so keeping an open mind, and the same goes for the rewatch. I had my own preconceived thoughts, based on the first time I had seen most of these films. But really taking some time to re-examine them and think about them again and have a fresh lens, really thinking about these films in a context where some of these have come out over 10 years ago, including the one that we're going to be talking about today. So I'm really excited about this series of podcast episodes that we're going to be doing. And then after this, who knows? Maybe about that time, it'll be the time for us to talk about the current DCU. Obviously, the MCU is still going. Star Wars will still be going. Rings of Power, all these different things in pop culture that I'm really excited to talk about with you guys as well. So today, we're going to be starting from the beginning with the 2013 film directed by Zack Snyder, Man of Steel. But before we get into that, guys, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to do so. This podcast will be up on the YouTube channel, but it will also be up on Spotify as well. the Access Blockbusters pod. So if you prefer to listen to it only on audio, head over to Spotify and you can listen to it there. If you prefer to have it on YouTube in the background, or if you want to, have it on YouTube for your convenience, then it'll also be there as well. And yeah, subscribe to the channel for more of these kinds of podcast episodes. Stay tuned for more. Obviously, the next one in this series, I with the scheduling that's kind of been rolling out, I'm not entirely sure when the next one will be, but we're going to start out with Man of Steel and see how it goes, see what the response is, and then go from there. But we will be doing Batman v Superman next. And I'm after seeing Man of Steel again for I think the second time ever, I'm really interested to go into Batman v Superman again. So, with all of that out of the way, let's get into Man of Steel. I'm going to be loosely basing these podcasts off of the way that I structured the other rewatch videos. Obviously, the other rewatch series were edited videos, and the reason I'm switching to podcast format for the time being is just because of time. It's a lot easier for me to kind of look at my notes and just talk freely about my thoughts on these films and these TV shows. I guess one TV show, Peacemaker. And so, yeah, but I still want to kind of keep it consistent with the format that I was using before. So we're gonna start out with just me talking about what I remember about the context of these films at the time that they were coming out. And some of these, by the way, like I mentioned, it's been 10 years, right? So it's been a while, and so I want to kind of go through that. Before we get into the sort of the breakdown. I took some notes during the film of Man of Steel, and then we'll talk about sort of how my outlook has shifted and how things have changed based on my own perspective. So 2013. So first of all, for those of you who have who remember at the time, Man of Steel, I believe, was executive produced by Christopher Nolan, and at the time there was a lot of debate going around whether or not Man of Steel was going to be a part of the Dark Knight franchise. And that's really interesting to me now, seeing the direction that they ended up going in anyways. But still, I think that this project, it was a project that Christopher Nolan was involved in, and it was going to be shaped sort of by that, as we turned from the Batman and Robins of the world to the Dark Knight kind of tone of the DC franchise, that we were going to be headed towards a more darker DC brand. And Man of Steel, I think, was definitely a step in that direction. So they hired Zack Snyder. And I believe that, at the time when Man of Steel did come out, while obviously they had plans to make a cinematic universe, I don't think anything was really set in stone. Similar to how Iron Man wasn't, they had Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, and I guess that they were sort of mapping out synergy because, Tony Stark shows up at the end of the Incredible Hulk, but, nothing like that in this film. You see a Wayne Enterprises, I believe, satellite in the film. But I don't think anything was set in stone that they had Ben Affleck cast and ready to go, and Batman, the solo Batman film, was coming out the next year or anything like that. So this was sort of a leap of faith, if you will. Obviously, we hadn't seen a Superman film since Superman Returns, I believe, and so it was it was a chance for a new iteration of the Man of Steel. And so, again, they cast Henry Cavill. Personally, I don't really remember at the time there being much controversy around the pick. I think he was pretty unknown at the time. Obviously, he has the physique for Superman for sure. British actor playing an American hero. It's kind of funny now that that's been a trend these days with, like Tom Holland, for example. But anyways, I think it was definitely a big film of curiosity for sure. People were kind of wondering, what is this new Superman going to be, especially with, Zack Snyder, who had done films like 300 and Watchmen before. What was this going to look like moving forward? And so I actually did not watch the film in theaters. I watched it about a couple years after, because the first DCEU film I watched in theaters was Batman v Superman. But before Batman v Superman came out, I remember watching Man of Steel at home, just so I could prepare to see Batman v Superman. So that was the first time I had seen the film, and actually that is the only time I had seen the film before this rewatch. So this is recently I had seen the film again in preparation for this podcast episode, and that was the second time that I had ever seen the film. So it was really interesting for me because while I had expectations heading into the second time, I was sort of just like, hey, this is a blank slate. I know the general beats of the movie. It's been a while. Literally, it's been almost 10 years since I had seen the film, and I just wanted to see what it was going to be like, because, to be honest, I don't remember liking the film a lot. I didn't remember disliking it at the first watch either. But I remember thinking that this film kind of felt slow. It felt a little boring, a little dark and muddled and gray. which again might speak more to myself than anything else at the time, because this was again 10 years ago. So I mean, it was almost a completely different me in general, right? Watching this movie, and I wasn't really into analyzing film or anything like that. I enjoyed the films for what they were, but it's much different now, the way that I look at films and the kind of outlook I have. So that was my mindset heading into Man of Steel for the second time. Now we're gonna go into sort of a breakdown. I took a lot of notes, and we're going to kind of be going off of that, going through the story and just giving some thoughts, and then I'll do an overall summary, and I'll talk about how this has changed my opinion at the end of this podcast episode. So here we go. We're going to start out with the old DC logo, which is kind of funny to me. I remember watching this again, and it was funny because I had seen the old DC logo for the first time in a long time, and it was just a reminder of this was an era of way before DC Studios and way before the DCEU and everything like that. Even the DCEU was not even a thing at this point, which was kind of funny. Right off the bat, though, one of the things that I noticed, I'm going to say this throughout the podcast episode probably because it's true. The music is incredible. Hans Zimmer. I mean, if I had to say the shining point of this film, and I'm not saying this because the film itself was bad or anything like that, I'm just saying that it's because this is so incredibly elevated and good, is that Hans Zimmer's score is probably the absolute best thing that has come out of not just Man of Steel, but the DCEU. The Man of Steel theme is amazing. I mean, if anything could have rivaled the John Williams original Superman theme, this does, and it fits, and it works, and it's epic, and it's not too bassy. Hans Zimmer kind of has that tendency to kind of go a little, Inception-y and all that kind of stuff. But no, this is totally appropriate for the Superman, the epicness, the melancholy, the reflectiveness, and everything like that. So right off the bat, when we're on Krypton, as we start out the film, Hans Zimmer's score, the drum beats, the very simple piano themes and everything like that. It's so there, but yet so part of the story that I think it works really great. The other thing that becomes very obvious from the beginning is that this is a true origin story, right? And we don't really see superhero films like that. In fact, I think James Gunn's Superman is probably not going to tell the origin story again, from what I understand, just like how Matt Reeves as the Batman didn't really tell the origin story of Bruce Wayne. And I think that that's okay at this point in time because we're so familiar, we've been so satirized with especially the big heroes, right? Like Hulk and, you had to tell your Captain Americas and your Iron Mans because people weren't really familiar with them. But Superman, Spider-Man, Hulk, Batman, people have seen, especially Batman. Like if they show, his parents being killed again, it's like for the 20th time, we'll get to that in Batman v Superman, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, this is a very, origin story kind of opening. Like it's like from the beginning we start out and then we go from there on Krypton. So that did stand out to me just because these days in 2024, 2025, 2026, we're not used to seeing that kind of stuff again. It was actually a little nice to kind of see a very particular and dedicated origin story because it's just, again, it's like kind of a throwback almost. The other thing too is that Zod, right? So you start out with Jor-El talking to the council on Krypton, but when Zod shows up, he is very intimidating. Michael Shannon, who plays Zod, really is, he's a formidable presence. Some of his acting choices, I will say, especially later on in the film, feel a little hammy and a little bit out of place, because I think that what you have here in the beginning is Russell Crowe's Jor-El, kind of a more muted and Shakespearean kind of character. And then you have Zod, who's almost just this kind of, not that he's not being Shakespearean, because the dialogue he's saying is also like that. But again, you have this kind of, general who's trying to be intimidating in front of the council and in front of Jor-El and trying to assert his presence and everything like that. Speaking of dialogue, I think that especially in these Krypton scenes, but also throughout the film, and this is probably going to be, and this is something I picked up right away, but it permeates throughout the rest of the film, is that I think the weakest point of this film for me is the dialogue. I think Chris Terrio, right, was the one who wrote the film, and he wrote Batman v Superman as well. Or was it David S. Goyer? I can't remember. Anyways, I think that there are times when this film really reminds me of the first Thor. And what I mean by that is that the first Thor had this very set tone. It wanted to dive into that Shakespearean element, so that when the characters are talking to one another, like Thor, like Odin, like Loki, and the Warriors 3 and Sif and everything, they wanted to be very regal and Shakespearean and everything like that. And I think that Zack Snyder also wanted to have that similar tone on Krypton. it works in certain places because you're seeing these kind of grandiose sets and very visually beautiful CGI landscapes of Krypton and these CGI animals that are really cool looking and whatnot. So in certain places, I will say it does work pretty well, but in others, it feels so stilted and wooden. That it almost took me out of the beginning conversations between Zod and Jor-El altogether, because again, it's just I understand wanting to have the tone feel kind of grandiose, but it sometimes the dialogue just doesn't translate. It almost feels like Russell Crowe is kind of it almost looks like he's pained to be saying some of the lines that he's saying. Maybe that's just me reading into it. But anyways, that's not really the point of the opening anyways. The point of it is, the setup and the action and the visuals. And, for everything you can say about Zack Snyder as a filmmaker, what he does incredibly well is the visuals and the action, the lighting, lens flares all over the place, by the way. I could have done with less lens flare. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. I think that it really does speak to how he was building out this world of Krypton, and it worked really well. I was really pleasantly surprised by how, a film that was made 10, almost 15 years ago now, it works. It looks beautiful. It works aesthetically. It has the gravitas. It has the groundedness, but also the grandiose, epic scale to feel worthy of Krypton. And I really like that as well. In terms of color palette, because that's something that people talk a lot about with these first Zack Snyder kind of DC films. Yeah, I mean, it is a little gray. The whole film is a little gray and muddled. Even Superman's suit isn't the vibrant blue and red. It's sort of a muted, dark navy blue. I think it's fine. I think it works for what this film wants to be. And, I mean, this film wants to be a very specific thing that I'll kind of dissect as we go along here. And whether or not I liked it, we'll have to, kind of see my thoughts later on. But it is going for a very specific tone. And for what that is, I think that, these things have to be consistent. And so, yeah, I mean, it is a little bit muted and it's a little bit less, popping and James Gunn-y or Taika Waititi or even, I don't know, what's another, like even Wonder Woman 1984. Like, these superhero films that pop a little bit more. It's not quite like that, which is fine because it was going for something, a very specific look. So yeah, now knowing that knowing that this was an origin story for Superman, the tone, or I guess the story feels a little bit kind of drawn out, I suppose. Just because, look, if you've seen this before, you know where everything's heading, you know that Krypton's going to explode and everything like that. And so at the beginning, especially when Jor-El is running around and he's talking to Lara and they're trying to ship Kal-El out to Earth and everything like that, I was like, okay, it just feels like it's being drawn out for the sake of being drawn out a little bit. That being said, one of the things that I did appreciate by that is because, I was saying to myself, what's the point of this, right? Other than just showing Superman's origin. And I think that the point of this opening sequence is to show Zod and his motivations, right? So you're getting to see more of Zod. He's sort of this disgruntled military commander who has this unbending allegiance to sort of the doctrine and the dogma and sort of something like that. Like he reminded me, again, not to keep comparing to the MCU. That's not what I'm here to do, but just relevant examples that come to mind in other superhero films, like almost a Mordo kind of figure, right? Which I think is really interesting. Someone who's so committed that they're kind of blinded, and Zod goes to the point of like actual just craziness and insanity. But still, I think it's a part of the character that needed to kind of be fleshed out a little bit more at the beginning, and I did appreciate that as well. So I think that worked really well. I also you do get all of these messianic signs of Clark Kent. It really emphasizes this film, the chosen one kind of angle of him. Obviously, later on, you see him in the water as sort of this Jesus figure with his arms spread out. And then at the beginning, Jor-El's saying he's the one who's going to save everybody and he's going to be Earth's hope and everything like that. Again, I think that this film decides to deliberately make some choices about Kal-El and the fact that he is going to be this sort of big savior figure of Earth, which sets him up to be this huge focal point later on in the film and later on in the DCEU. But it was just, it was something that I thought was interesting and noticed as well. The fights between the characters, by the way, the hand-to-hands between Jor-El and Zod at the beginning were really good. I thought that for the most part, there was some shaky cam and there was some quick cutting, but for the most part, I thought that the hand-to-hand action worked really well. It was at this point, though, that I kind of thought, especially when Michael Shannon was being banished and he yells at Laurie, he's like, I will find him. I thought it almost feels like he's part of a different movie altogether. That being said, he's not in the film for too very long. And I think when he is in the film, the point of him is just to be scary. And he is scary. So yeah, there's that. Now, after this opening prologue into Krypton, we jump a little bit into the future instead of continuing the origin story, right as like we're not just following Kal-El as a baby. And I actually really like that because you do have the beginning of the film, which is very origin heavy, right? It's very much, hey, this is the beginning of, Kal-El and the beginning of Superman. But I actually really did appreciate that the writers and the director, Zack Snyder and Terry, I believe, could be wrong, decided to actually jump forward when he's an adult and he's having to deal with these struggles of, trying to find out who he is and what kind of, hero and what kind of man he gets to be. And then we kind of, flashback into, flashback is to him as a boy. Now, we do quickly get into those flashbacks. And one of the first flashbacks is, I believe, him in the classroom, where he's discovering his powers, which is setting up later the fact that when Zod comes to Earth, he is overwhelmed by his senses and all of that kind of stuff. And I don't think this particular scene was super well executed, especially the scene where his mom, by the way, Diane Lane is just a phenomenal Ma Kent, and I think that Kevin Costner is great as well as Pa Kent. So there's that. I mean, I think that Diane Lane was just amazing, so good. But I think that this scene where he comes out of that janitor's closet and he's like, why am I so different, Mom, in front of everybody else was a little bit over the top. And I guess, there are just some scenes, right? Because I think that the Shakespearean dialogue and all of those elements of the film, they don't just end on Krypton, is something that I noticed, right? The dialogue feels very heavy and ham-fisted in a lot of other places. And sometimes, because it almost feels like the writers of this film are trying with every single line to write a line that is like, oh, it's worthy of Shakespeare, and it's going to be this quoted line and everything like that, rather than just make dialogue that kind of fits within the story. It almost feels like every single line has to be super memorable. And honestly, I think that for the most part, this doesn't really land in a film like this. There are a couple lines that are just beautiful in this movie. Just beautiful lines. But for the most part, when every single line is supposed to be just like hammering you over the head with some kind of lesson or something like that, like, what's wrong with me, Mom? And then she says something like, you're special, and some variant of that. It's like, okay, we get it. I don't know. It's not too much of a bother, but it's just something that I noticed, and it's definitely, like I mentioned, one of the weaker parts of the film. Then we get the scene with the bus and him saving the whole bus. I get what Pa Kent was saying afterwards when he's talking to Pa, and he's like, hey, like, are you saying I shouldn't have saved the bus? And then, Kevin Costner kind of pauses and he's like, maybe. And I'm like, I get it. I kind of get what the writers were thinking about at that point, but I still, every time I think about that scene and when I watch it again, I'm like, that is actually crazy. He's like, so Clark, I just want you to let all your classmates die and you're the only one that survives. Like, in what world does he think that, that's not going to draw attention to Clark Kent as well? I think that was taking, that was almost a too extreme example of what Pa Kent was trying to say. Anyways, it's not a huge deal. It's just something that I picked on. So I do think it is a genuinely good conversation. It is still a crazy thing to say. So there's that. But later, they go on into the shed and they see the ship, the pod that Clark was delivered in. And I mean, here's an example of dialogue being, working really well, because this is where the writers are like, we want to really hammer home, these points. And obviously that conversation where Clark says, can't I pretend I'm your son? And, Pa Kent says, you are my son. It's a fantastic line. I know it sounds like I'm nitpicking a little bit. It's just that at this point I was noticing the dialogue so much that I did notice a little bit that the dialogue feels a little bit rushed, right? I almost felt like in that scene, you wanted to have Pa Kent go, you wanted Clark to go, can't I pretend I'm your son? And then I almost wanted a little bit more of a pause. So it's like, can't I pretend I'm your son? And then you get the hug, and then he goes, you are my son. And it felt like every line was just delivered in such rapid succession. Again, almost like a play, right? I mean, that's what kind of took me out of this film a little bit. Sometimes it doesn't feel like these are real people talking. I get all of the allegories and the symbolisms behind these lines, but sometimes it just doesn't feel like these are real people. Anyways, I digress. I think the scenes also where Clark has to hide his identity and deal with his humanity are quite profound. I think that if you're going to do flashbacks, right, and if you're going to do an origin story, I really enjoyed that you're putting Clark Kent in these moral and situational dilemmas, and you're having to wrestle with him being Superman. I think it's a kind of a different take on Superman, or it's something that maybe not a lot of superhero films deal with this early in the origin. But I think that it's something that's quite interesting for Superman. Then we get introduced to Lois Lane again, dialogue delivery, just I don't know. It's Amy Adams is a great actress, but the dialogue that she's being given is like, what is she even says at one point, "What if I need a tinkle?" And I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody actually wrote that into the script. Also, characters making kind of dumb decisions. Like I get the characteristic of Lois Lane in the comic books is being an intrepid reporter and being so curious and everything like that. She also was told it's going to be negative 40 degrees outside, and she decides to go out. It's like, okay, I guess you got to get the story moving along. I understand. It was also at this point when I kept referring to the massive lens flares that kept going on in the film. There were so many of them, but anyways, neither here nor there. When Superman though first meets Lois and he rescues her in the Fortress of Solitude, it was a really nice scene. The first meeting was nice, and I think that I think that for the most part by this point in the film, I think we were about a quarter into the film, maybe a third. It was really nicely paced, and that's something that surprised me because I didn't remember, one of the things that I thought about the first time I had seen Man of Steel was that I thought it was a little bit slow. I think now thinking back to it, it was probably just me thinking like this is sort of a muted, more dark film, that I thought it was a little bit boring and not as colorful as other films, and it wasn't humorous that much as well. But this time I was really able to appreciate the pacing of the film because it was telling the origin story, it was going into the present moment, but it was also not slowing down, which is something that I think is really worthwhile. And it has this kind of, even though it's not always succeeding in this execution, it's always aiming for a kind of gravitas and groundedness and seriousness that I can't say that much about other comic book movies, and I think that I really appreciate it. We get to the Daily Planet with Lois, and again, this dialogue rears its ugly head. It's like it's exposition or it's life lessons or whatever. Lois is like, Perry, it's me. Come on. I'm a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. And I'm like, are you serious with this dialogue? You couldn't have found any better way to have had, these like Oscar caliber actors deliver this dialogue to from Amy Adams to Lawrence Fishburne. Anyways, I could be here forever if I talked about the dialogue. So, yeah. Anyways, there's that. We get some exposition from Jor-El to Kal-El. This exposition I don't mind because it's a little bit, heavy-handed. But again, it's kind of necessary where Jor-El's telling Kal about who he is and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, at this point, I said to myself, I'm really enjoying this movie. It's a very solid origin story of Superman, but you can't help but feel like it's sort of a kind of a condensed Wikipedia origin, but still, it's brought to life really solidly, and I was having a good time with it. So. Moving on, I guess I should, before we move on, I should talk a little bit about Henry Cavill as Superman thus far. He hasn't, had his first flight scene up until this point, so it's not like we've seen Superman, but I think that Henry Cavill was just solid. I think that Henry Cavill kind of embodies my overall thoughts with this film. He's really solid. He has to play this more stoic and tortured Superman, more than the joyful, exuberant Superman, which he, I don't think he is as good at, as we see later on in future DCU films. But again, he didn't really get a chance to be that kind of Superman. And so for what he was asked to do in this one, in Man of Steel, I think that he did a really good job. But then we get to probably my favorite part of the entire film, and arguably I think the most popular and most well-liked part of this movie, which is the first flight scene. This is where all of the different elements of the film that either weren't working or were working or to varying degrees come together in a way that is so harmonious and so beautiful. This scene alone, right, where you have the voiceover from Jor-El and his speech to Kal. And again, it's that same writing. It's this over-dramatic Shakespearean kind of dialogue. But it works because this scene is supposed to be inspirational, aspirational, uplifting, motivating. The Hans Zimmer score is beating Henry in the suit for the first time. The visuals. This is probably as close to perfect as you can get for a Superman film. I loved this scene. I got goosebumps. I was smiling. I got chills. This part, of the film is unbelievably good. And I can't sing Zack Snyder's praises enough for the fight scene, because it's, oh my goodness, it's amazing. I remember liking it the first time as well, but yeah, no, I think that that's wonderful. Jumping back to Lois Lane, we get to see her being a reporter again as she looks for, tries to figure out who Clark is. And I think that that's a very, it's a solid kind of representation, if not a little bit one-dimensional representation of her character. Then we get the flashback with Jonathan Kent, Pa Kent, giving up his life, for his son's secret identity. And I think that this was a much more real and believable example of who Pa Kent was and what his beliefs were for hiding Clark's identity. I think the bus example was just so extreme, but I think that him dying in the tornado so that Clark would not reveal himself to people. Although I wish that was, maybe drawn out a little bit more. It's like, why? I mean, just so that, he could fit in, maybe, I suppose. But yeah, no, I think that it worked really well. And I'll also say that as we go back to the present timeline, one thing that I was amazed by, because even in the next couple of films, right, Henry Cavill looks a lot older in the next couple of films. He looks like a more seasoned, experienced Superman in Batman v Superman and in Justice League as well. But in this film, I was really just surprised and pleasantly surprised that he looked really youthful. And I'm not saying that he looked old in the future films. I'm saying that actually it's more talking about this movie, that he had that very youthful, boyish look of Superman in this movie that I hadn't really seen before, or I didn't remember seeing. So I really liked that as well. Okay, then we get some scenes with the military. General Swanwick, I believe, who turns out to be Martian Manhunter, which is a little, I don't know, it's interesting. Martian Manhunter, for those of you who haven't seen the Snyder Cut, that's where that's revealed. And also, it's Richard Schiff from West Wing, Toby Ziegler, always playing a kind of a military operations kind of guy, as Emil Hamilton here. For those of you who haven't seen the West Wing, he's fantastic in it. So anyways, yeah, and then, at this point when we involve the military is sort of when the film kicks into a different gear. And I'm not necessarily saying that it becomes better or worse. I'm just saying it kind of shifts into a different mode. Because I think that this is sort of when the alien invasion part of the movie kind of starts. And so we just have Zod casually showing up to Earth. Also, Lois just running from the FBI is interesting. And I don't know. Like, this is the part of the film where I was like, okay, I'm still on board about what's going on here. I think what I was thinking about as we got to this part of the film where Superman is talking to Lois in that interrogation cell, and then he's talking to General Swanwick, and then he's handed over to Zod. It almost felt like this was the third act of the film. And so at this point, I was almost expecting the film to be over in 30 or 45 minutes before realizing that we were only halfway through the film. And I'm not entirely sure why that was, honestly. Because I feel like maybe I'm just so, I've seen so many of these kinds of films to know that, okay, the hero's being handed over, and then there's going to be this final fight where they invade Earth and everything like that. And I was like, okay, so we're gearing up for that. But that doesn't really come until about 30 to 45 minutes later, and this is just sort of a precursor to that. But it feels like almost that this film doesn't have a middle. Because I think with the origin flashbacks, as soon as the origin flashbacks end, it's about halfway through the film, and then you're kind of shifting into another gear where now it's just completely in the present. And I just thought it felt a little bit weird because it almost feels like this film doesn't have a middle. So it didn't build up a lot of, just quieter moments, right, between in the present, I mean, because it took a lot of time to build up the quieter moments in the past, but not in the present. And so case in point, I think that I can get why Clark and Lois are in love. Maybe it just didn't feel like it was warranted. I know they don't kiss until later, but like they're teasing the romance out, and it feels like the writers were more saying, oh, they're in love because it's Clark and Lois, not because of really anything that happened in the film other than Clark saving her and then her thinking that he's attractive. I don't know. I honestly don't know. It almost feels like, honestly, the first Thor movie in a weird sense. A lot of similarities there, where you kind of have this, godlike being with this Earth, plucky kind of character. I hate the word plucky. That's not the right word, but you know what I mean. Kind of a brave, intrepid reporter / scientist kind of character, and then fish out of water and all that kind of stuff. By the way, another Jesus parallel, which I thought, I'm like, oh, you're really hammering it over our heads. That like they say that Kal-El's 33, Jesus was 33 when he died and was raised again. So like all these kinds of parallels, there are just, I feel like at some point you got to kind of go, we get it. Like the audience, doesn't need to be hit over the head with all this symbolism all the time. That's really, again, just it kind of pairs with the dialogue in that way where I feel like it's sometimes a little too much for me. But that's just my personal opinion. So then we get a meeting between Zod and Cal for the first time on that ship. And I respect the character. It's a little one-dimensional, but he's interesting, at least because he's an adherent to his ideology, which is good. There was no reason, though, in my mind, for Lois to be on that ship. I mean, there was actually like little to no reason that she had to be on that ship. And then Jor-El just kind of being like a GPS for her was, I don't know, was kind of funny in an unintentional way. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. At this point, though, we start to get to the brunt of what the third act actually is, because, well, we get the, well, first of all, okay, I should say, the third act hasn't even started yet, because what we get here is a precursor to the third act with Kal-El fighting Feora and then the other Kryptonian. And I will say, right, and I'm glad that this got addressed in Batman v Superman, because it is, I'm watching the film again. And I heard at the time all these people, complaining about the fact that, oh, there's like all this destruction and everything, and you can't just ignore that. And I was like, I don't know. I mean, every superhero film has tons of destruction. Well, I watched the movie again, and oh my gosh, there is so much destruction. It was like Zack Snyder took single, practical set or CGI rendering, and he said, how many buildings can we actually destroy? How many billions of dollars or millions of dollars of damage can we cause? And how many people can we kill? Just civilian casualties. And I doubt that his original plan was to address this, because I just think it was what was just the aesthetic of the film, because it just keeps happening. And in this particular film, there was no indication that any of it was going to get addressed. Like, the film just resolves itself at the end. Luckily, they picked that up in Batman v Superman, because I think it's so important that you need to address that, because it's crazy how many buildings and explosions and things like that there are. Like, that also was something that took me out of the movie at certain times, because I was just sitting there mouth agape being like, how much destruction is there going to be in this movie? Anyways, I digress. So then we finally get into the third act of the film, which is, you have this kind of, I'm not going to lie, I think that the human characters like Lois and Perry, Perry who's just trying to save someone from rubble, which is basically his only role in this film, and then Lois, who is on the plane for some crazy reason. She's on the plane with this bomb or whatever that they're going to destroy the world engine with. But we get into the brunt of the third act, and it's about the world engine. It's about terraforming the Earth. It's another Earth-ending kind of event, all that kind of stuff. Which again is fine. Like, it's actually a fairly compelling finale. There's a lot of cool action going on. People are doing things. Superman's flying against the world engine. Obviously, the visuals are great. The lens flares and everything. Just kind of, it feels like a lot. And Superman fighting against giant metal tentacles was not something I remembered at all from this film, from the world engine. And yes, people are still dying. Civilians are still dying. It's crazy how much destruction is going on here. But it is, at the end of the day, it is fairly entertaining in terms of a finale. It feels like the film kind of hit into that gear a little too early, because, like I said, the halfway point felt like the introduction to the third act here. And I don't know, it felt like it kept going on that gear for the entire rest of the film. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. Because again, when the world engine is destroyed, that's not even the ending of the film, because there's this whole other fight between Zod and Kal. And what I wished from that, even though it looks cool and all, it's like CGI bodies flying through the air and fighting each other, it looks cool. But I mean, what I really would have hoped for was, once the world engine is destroyed, you kind of find a way to skip through all of the flying through the air destruction and just get to the moral dilemma at the end of the film that you wanted to get to, which is Superman having to make this decision to kill Zod. Now, here's what I will say about that. Because I know that this was, at least at the time, a big point of controversy, whether Superman should have killed Zod or not. I have no problem with this kind of moral dilemma, and I have no problem with this version of Superman having to make that hard choice, because that is what the film was going for, right? This film was going for a more tortured Superman, stoic Superman, who was faced with all these moral conundrums about who he was and what kind of world he lived in. And it was kind of a darker world where people forced him to make choices he wasn't comfortable with. And it turned out to be like a darker Superman, not because Henry Cavill was an evil Superman or a dark Superman, but just because it was darker in tone, right? And honestly, within the context of this film, I have no problem with that, because I think that is exactly what they set out to do. They did it successfully. And that was that. And I think that, again, putting him in moral dilemmas, because it's not like Superman was like, I'm going to murder you, Zod. It's like he had to make that choice because of all the extenuating circumstances. That being said, as I watched this film, I enjoyed it, right? I enjoyed, a lot of what the film had to say about this version of Superman. I will admit, though, at the end of the film, I was really missing that exuberant, joyful Superman that I wish we had gotten. It's almost like this film was the second film in the franchise, because usually in the first film, you're going to get that joyful kind of character discovering themselves and learning who they are. And then in the second film, they're challenged in this way. I think back to the first Spider-Man film where, the first film, he wasn't like joyful, or he wasn't happy all the time, but it was learning the ropes, right? And all that. In the second film, you get this a little bit more tortured version of Spider-Man who just can't figure out who he is and all that kind of stuff. And that makes some more sense to me, where Spider-Man is faced with some moral dilemmas and whatnot. I just feel like I'm a little sad because I don't think we got the Henry Cavill version of Superman that was truly joyful and a symbol of peace and a symbol of hope and a symbol of, everything. Because I mean, for everything in the DCU, like for every time the characters are saying, oh, he's a symbol of hope and we love him and everything like that, I'm like, I get that he saved a lot of you guys. I just don't see that, though. I just don't quite see how this is a character that we're like, yes, like this is the joy that we're missing in the world. And again, I'm not saying that this is a bad thing in terms of Man of Steel, because I really did enjoy Man of Steel. It's just something that by the time I got to the ending of the film, I just realized I'm missing a little bit of that. And so that actually makes me look forward to James Gunn's Superman a lot more, because I know that he's kind of hearkening back to those roots of that kind of boyish optimism that's met with then the darker elements of this world. Again, I want to make it clear that this is all not a knock against this version of Superman. It's just maybe not the version of Superman that would have been my favorite, but I did quite enjoy what this Superman, had to offer. And by the way, I mean, it's not like it wasn't there, right? At the very end of the film, you see that kind of, grin and the boyish smile when Superman, or I guess Clark Kent in that ending scene, meets Lois Lane in the Daily Planet. That sort of made me go, oh man, I kind of wish we had gotten a Man of Steel 2. Not necessarily like post Justice League, but post Man of Steel 1, we had gotten a Man of Steel 2 where we got to see his progression as this more optimistic kind of Superman, kind of finding his way in the world. I digress, though. We obviously never got that, and we hopefully will get, a version of that with James Gunn's Superman. But like I said, I want to make it clear that I did really enjoy this iteration of Superman. It was just different, And I think that's about it for the Man of Steel breakdown for me, my thoughts on it. So overall, as we wrap up my thoughts here, I did enjoy this film. I had some problems with it, and I don't think it's a perfect film by any means. I think that, the beginning is paced pretty well, but then once you kind of get to that middle, it feels like a lot of it was just condensed and rushed in favor of this huge action finale, which is fine. But it feels like a lot of it could honestly have been cut out, and then you could have put a little bit of a slower middle in there, just to kind of, flesh out these relationships between Lois and Clark and who Superman is as he finds himself. Anyways, I think that all, like Henry Cavill as Superman was really good. I think that, most of the casting was pretty spot on. Amy Adams is pretty good as Lois Lane. Lawrence Fishburne, Michael Shannon was pretty good. Russell Crowe was fine. Huge shout out also to Kevin Costner and Diane Lane as Pa and Ma Kent. Obviously, the visuals were fantastic for the most part. Some of it obviously a little CGI, but it was 2013. What can you do? And obviously, I have to give a shout out to the score, because the score is just phenomenal. Without the score, I find it hard to believe that this film could be half of what it ended up being, because the score is just Hans Zimmer. Like I said, it is just everything that you could have ever wanted in a Superman score that was not derivative of the John Williams score, right? It's its own thing, but it's joyful, it's hopeful, and yet it's epic. It's big in scope, and I love that about the film. So yeah, I mean, just transitioning to the ending of this podcast episode, where, in these previous rewatch videos, I would talk about how my thoughts have changed from the first time. Again, the first time I was much younger. I think I was just kind of bored because the film didn't look as colorful and it wasn't as joyful and anything like that as other superhero films at the time. I really did get a deeper appreciation for Man of Steel this time around. I liked it significantly more, and I'm really glad I rewatched it, because now I have this as my lasting memory of the film. I'll be very curious to see what I think about Batman v Superman, because A, it's a much more recent film, 2013 versus 2016. And B, I have seen this film a couple times. I saw the original in theaters, and I saw the Ultimate Edition later on. I'd probably be watching the Ultimate Edition this time around just to see, but it's been a while anyways. And so I'm really interested to see whether my thoughts shift significantly. But for now, for Man of Steel, I'm really glad I rewatched the film because, again, I have this newfound appreciation for the film. Not a perfect film by any stretch of the imagination, in my opinion at least, but those are just my thoughts. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. So, again, especially with these DC films that are a little bit more divisive, I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. Let's have a respectful discussion. Sharing our thoughts, sharing your thoughts, sharing your opinions, and making sure to respect everyone's opinions in the comments down below. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will be back with another episode in the coming weeks, either Batman v Superman or something else. And in the meantime, subscribe to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, rate the Access Blockbusters pod on Spotify, and I will see you guys in the next one.